There is no doubt that the issue of violent radicalisation, and especially violent youth radicalisation, is one of the key themes in the interest of the media. I believe that the road that we have taken for security policy in Europe and the practices and the mindset that we have adopted is leading to further division and also the erosion of human rights. So just to illustrate my point, I'm using an example of the attacks, whether these were failed, stopped or completed in the entire European Union in 2017. So according to official statistics, there were 205 of them. 107 of these failed, stopped or completed attacks were in the United Kingdom, and the UK is known internationally for having one of the most draconian pieces of legislation as well as the most expensive anti-terrorism policy. And yet more than half of those failed, stopped or completed attacks took place in this country. So we have to ask ourselves if the current policies, these very strict policies that look at the individual as a risk and try to manage that risk by increasing penalties and taking liberties away from society, whether they work or not. And maybe look at alternative ways. And I have been looking at these alternative ways for the last 10 years through a model that I have been piloting across Europe, but especially in the UK and in the SE16 London area where we're based and the RJ for All Community Centre is based. And that is the positive approach with the restorative justice practice and ethos thrown into it. And what this model looks at is looking at the individual from a positive approach, tapping into their talents, into their beliefs, nurturing those talents, and focusing on promoting those talents and resilience as opposed to managing whatever risk that particular individual might demonstrate, whether are the risks that we tend to think are risks, such as religion, faith, belief, poverty, or the true risks that lead to violent radicalisation, and especially violent youth radicalisation. And most of those triggers, in my view, are society failure. So I'm really pleased to have Professor Thomas Toscano from Buckinghamshire University, where I'm also a visiting professor, to talk about this topic within the context of universities. Yeah, welcome to the RJ webinar series. It's a real pleasure to have you as a guest. Would you like to introduce yourself first and just tell us, where you are, where you work, a bit of background?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Dion. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me, actually. So my name is Thomas Toscano, and I work at Buckinghamshire University as a deputy head of school for the School of Health and Social Care Professions. I'm an associate professor for education and professional practice. So my background is I'm a qualified social worker, but I have interest in restorative justice, positive psychology, really anything to do with making people feel good about themselves and having a better life for themselves. I think sometimes within social work things can be very bureaucratic. So one of the things that I'm really keen on is person-centered social work, which is a module I teach, and also co-authored a book on personalization for social workers, opportunities and challenges in frontline practice, which really talks about the need for social work to be more person-centered. So that's me.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And Thomas and I have worked for many years now, but especially in the field of violent youth radicalisation and restorative justice, and we've done a few publications together as well, which is why I wanted to speak to you about the work that you're doing and some of the work that we did in universities within the context of violent youth radicalisation. and the viewers, they come from all over the world, so it would be good to kind of put it in the international context as well. There are some people actually that I know from the United States that are doing some work on restorative justice at universities, especially with complex cases, which include racism, some violent radicalization cases. So we'll be very, very keen to hear from you. And I'll start with the first question. As somebody who works in a university, you're a professor. What is your experience of the government's, of the UK government's agenda, and how effective do you think this agenda is in preventing violent youth radicalization in universities?
Yeah, Theo, radicalization is a problem or an issue that's everywhere. And I think, particularly when there are specific situations of very obvious attacks on civil liberty, and so there tends to be, and understandably, a knee-jerk reaction to do something about it. So there have been instances where in educational institutions like universities, there have been people who have been radicalized already coming into a university setup and then promoting radicalization to others, or for people who are not radicalized but come to university and then get radicalized. So the UK government came up with a strategy called Prevent, which had very specific goals to sort of respond to any ideological challenges that ideologies that challenge terrorism, to prevent people from being involved in terrorism, and also to work with institutions to sort of support and advise people so that they're not sort of drawn towards terrorist activity. And while it's really a useful thing to consider, personally, I think it is much more than that. Than just trying to identify people and perhaps pigeonholing people into groups, which perhaps might be more divisive. Although the agenda, particularly in the university that I come from, is not to pigeonhole people, but to look at radicalization, whether it is Islamic or whether it's white supremacist, and not to say that radicalization only exists in certain groups of people. But having said that, it's still, for me, not enough in terms of, and it doesn't really deal with the core of the problems. And I think that's why, Theo, the project that you and I, among several others, worked on was so important. So maybe we can talk about that later in the interview.
Yeah, and I think what you just said, it kind of highlights my main philosophy when it comes to addressing or preventing violent youth radicalization, especially youth radicalization, which is not to look at the individual as a risk, but look at the potential that each one of us have and tap into those potential as talents and nurture those talents. And what you're saying about looking at a specific group, a specific minority, a specific religious group, and looking at that and trying to manage whatever risks are associated with that group, their characteristics or whatever it is, I mean, for me, has never been the good approach. And I think our work has showed that if you do have a positive approach, especially when it comes to young people, there are a lot more possibilities and there are a lot more chances of achieving what you want to achieve. And we have shown that in different contexts, including universities.
Absolutely. And I think, just if you wouldn't mind me moving on to the project that we actually did together, which was, for me, possibly one of the most enriching experiences personally that I've had, because like you, it is very much in line with my own view about people in general and what makes people tick. So within university, we really looked at within the background of violent youth radicalization, went down to really the things that are most important to people. And so we worked with a group of students that was very diverse culturally. So there were people who were immigrants to the UK, there were white British people, there were people of different faiths, there were people from different parts of Europe. So it was quite a beautiful mix of groups. And the questions that we asked them is basically what makes you, how do you understand your own identity, and what does sort of well-being mean to you? And the diversity of opinions was absolutely flabbergasting. Because we like you just said, we tend to say that for this group of people, this will be what they consider their identity and what they consider well-being. But even within groups that we've just talked about, maybe a group of Muslims, how they see themselves as Muslims and British Muslims is very different to from one person to the other. So it's about, I think, getting to understand what makes people tick. What is it? What are their hopes and dreams for themselves? And I think personally, if we understand that and help people to understand or articulate what their dreams are for themselves, and provide the resources to make that happen, then I think people don't have time to be radicalized or engage in violent radicalization. I think it's because of trying to remove anger against society from people, which is, I think, the cause for violent radicalization. But if people are really happy with who they are, and they feel happy with the circumstances around them, and they feel comfortable with how they interact with the environment they find themselves in, they feel welcomed in that environment, I think, violent radicalization will not have a place in our society. But equally, considering that it's a journey, and this is the start of a journey, it's not going to happen tomorrow. So I know we've had criticism, Theo, about, okay, but how is it going to solve the problem of radicalization now? It may not solve it now because, we probably already have people who are radicalized to violence. But I think it's looking at the future and creating a better future for the next generations, perhaps. So I think the work that mostly you are doing, Theo, is helping that agenda of getting to younger people, of helping younger people to understand that well-being is important, and for us to create that policy change to help create that environment around them.
Yeah, and universities is such a special place, isn't it, as an environment? And we looked at different environments, so violent radicalization in prisons, in schools, in universities, and obviously another environment now is online, with lots of radical activity takes place. But the interesting thing, I think, for universities is that this is a place where young people go to educate themselves, and create their future, right? And it is also a place where, they meet all sorts of cultures, because, schools are great, but, universities, you get people from all over the world, right? And that's why, I think because it's such a special place, moving on to kind of my second question, if you kind of think of it like a case study, I like working with case studies, and you think of a young person who, independently of where they're from, right, and they are, at risk of committing acts of violent radicalization, and we don't want to look at them in the kind of normal prevent agenda way, the usual way. What would you think would be an alternative way of looking at that young person and hoping that what you are doing would do a better job than using, the government's approach of risk managing that person?
Yeah. As you say, a university is a really good place. It's a special place because people come to university usually for the sole purpose of developing themselves, of creating opportunities for themselves. And I think for us as a university, it's important to speak to the individual. So for example, we have things like personal tutors to be able to really get to know individual students and to understand what their hopes and aspirations are for themselves, not just for the time that they are with us, which may be 2 or 3 years, depending on the program that they're doing, but what are their hopes and aspirations for themselves for the future, and help them through whatever course they are doing to try and develop that. And also sort of providing within the university the welfare and pastoral support that people need, and to most importantly, what came out from the project that we did together is the importance of having space within the university, to intellectual space, to talk about issues openly and honestly. So to promote freedom of speech, to promote freedom of expression in a safe way, and with people who are sort of experienced in dealing with very emotive issues. So I think it's really about to answer the question of individual students, of how we get them to a place where they are more at peace with themselves and the world around them. So I think we are uniquely placed to provide that space for people to have honest discussions, and this really came out in the focus group discussion that we did for the project, where there were very different opinions about things, and people were able to say in a safe environment what they thought and how they felt disadvantaged by the environment that they came into, and to channelize that into something positive, to work through those disappointments and that anger, using, of course, things like restorative justice, and that's important as well, to look at how we can sort of help people develop into the person that they want.
Yeah, and that very nicely takes me to my third question, which is, one of the things that really fascinates me about your work is the use, you as a social worker as well, because this is one of the values of social work, isn't it? To use kind of the positive approach and the good lives model and positive psychology to look at this issue. And my question really relates to the university context, and how do you think now restorative justice, and one of these methods, of course, is dialogue. How do you think restorative justice can be used in a university like your university through positive psychology to prevent these incidents?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question to think about, and I must admit that institutions have structures, and I think it's really important that the structures that we have lend themselves to promoting positive psychology, restorative justice, and the good lives model. It's because I think we have a good starting point, because no student sort of comes in wanting to be difficult or wanting to get involved in things that will damage their own future career. Everybody comes in with the desire to better themselves, to better their own lives, and perhaps we get a lot of students who are mature students, we call them, who have families, to better the lives of their families. So I think it's again about what I said earlier, of helping people to understand what makes them tick, giving them the opportunity. First of all, I think the difficulty is sometimes people have not had an opportunity or the space, or nobody has asked them what they want in life. And so to help them articulate, first of all, what is it that you really want in life? And from there, then to build that up, to say, what can you do to create that life for yourself? How can you create the identity that you are so craving for yourself? And I think it's about, again, that individual personal contact with people, to provide that space for dialogue, for discussion, to help them to sort of understand what resources are also out there. And I think we are also uniquely placed to put people in contact with the right resources as well. So, for example, I mean, one of the things that we are trying to do is get involved in various faith groups in the community that the university finds itself in. And I think that's important to have those sort of interactions, not just within the university, but to think also outside of the university and say, what impact can we as a university have in the local community that we find ourselves in?
Yes. Yeah, and I think, I mean, what you said about promoting restorative justice, positive psychology in university, I think that's, that's a very hard thing to do. I think one of the difficulties of restorative justice is this promotion and awareness, because you and I know a lot about it, but how many students know about it? We might just be doing it, but not many people know about it as an option, isn't it? And my question to you, as somebody who also works in administration, not just teaching, is how do you think a university can raise awareness of restorative justice, not just for violent radicalization, but generally of restorative justice as a method that could address conflicts between students or students and staff, or or just as a methodology, that could be an alternative methodology for any prevention of conflict?
Yeah, and for that, I know we, as part of the project, we did create sessions that helped develop an understanding of restorative justice, positive psychology, and the Good Lives model, which we ran with staff, and which was much appreciated. And I think it's about, again, creating that space to have those kinds of inputs for students as well, to help students within the curriculum to try and find the space to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think I think it should be perhaps part of the curriculum in some ways, because if it isn't, it'll never get done. But I think for me, as to answer the question, as a person sort of involved in administration, is also to first get the staff on board, and then say, we think that this particular topics might be of interest to your students, and I think a good way is to have already prepared sessions that can be taken off the shelf and delivered, with, of course, each individual's own perspective. So I think maybe that might be something that we could perhaps try out in the future.
Yes, and definitely there is interest of as a research topic, because I know there's more PhDs now on restorative justice, there are more master's theses, there is also new programs now, masters in restorative justice, so there's a lot of academic interest. It's just how we use, I guess, restorative justice for for actual practical things, and violent youth radicalization in universities is a reality, so it's how we actually get to use it, I guess. So I think thank you very much for the interview. I think I will put in the description under the video the new courses that we created, the e-courses, which are all free. After the project that we completed, we had some further work done with European partners, and 2 projects created training courses for 2 different groups, one for youth workers to use the model that we just described, the positive model, and working with young people in a more positive approach and through positive psychology. And the other one is for anyone who works in the criminal justice system. And as we know, prisons are, breeding grounds for not just violent radicalization, but also any kind of violence. So I'll put those links below, and please feel free to share them. But no, thank you very much. Any concluding thoughts before we wrap up our seminar?
No, I think, first of all, thank you for, this has been really interesting talking to you, Theo. And I think, it's just about working together with like-minded people to promote this agenda, really, because the long term, I really believe this, the long-term solution to violent radicalization is to start with young people, to give them a different way of experiencing and looking at their world that's positive, and that enhances the humanness of people and their own aspirations. So I think it's about it boils down to that, of starting young, helping people see the world differently.
Absolutely, and it's inspiring to hear you saying, I mean, you are a teacher, so I'm not surprised that, you see the best in people, and especially young people, because we have to, right? And as parents, we have to look at our children and see the best in them. And if we can do that with our own children, I think we can do that with others as well. And I don't know if you noticed, but I keep saying violent radicalization. Yeah. I don't say radicalization, because history has showed, and I come from an ex-colony, an ex-British colony. History has showed that is young people, and through radical actions, that liberated their countries. And radicalization is not by default a bad thing; it's actually a very good thing. And young people have these amazing ideas. They have radical ideas that change the world for the better. Is violent radicalization that we are talking about. So radicalization that brings violence, and violence brings more violence. And that's why, I wanted to make that distinction, and see young people, for the truth that they are, and then, the future that they hold.
Interesting that you say that, Theo, because actually I do a session on violent radicalization, and I begin with saying that radicalization is something positive. It's because you're firmly convinced about something, but it only becomes unpleasant when it's violent radicalization. So thank you for making that clear, because we actually do a session on, and very often students are, how can you say radicalization is positive? Then they go and explain what I mean, and then they, oh yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, they could call us radicals, right? Because having these ideas about terrorists and thinking about them as human beings, it is radical, and it does, like restorative justice, it requires us to change lenses, the way that we view things. And if we're able to do that, then we've got chances of looking at a different solution, I guess.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian.
Yeah.
Bye.